All right, welcome everybody to our latest edition of our book club, the U.S. Society for Ecological Economics. And today's book discussion will be about Less is More, How Degrowth Will Save the World. And we are very fortunate once again to have former President Laura Schmitt Olabisi doing the discussion. So I'll turn it over to you, Laura.
Thanks, John. So I see a lot of folks on the call that, of course, are very familiar with the U.S. Society for Ecological Economics, as an understatement. But we have some folks I don't recognize, and so some of you may not be. So let me just back up and say a little bit about what USSEE is. So we are a society that is concerned about human well-being on a finite planet, I guess is the best way to put it. And we consist of academics and practitioners, folks in the government sector, folks in the nonprofit sector, who get together and talk about these ideas and try to put them into practice. So we've been around since the 90s, since the 80s-ish. This is kind of one of the things we are doing to try to have meaningful conversations about real world issues in real time in a non-academic way. So some of us are academics, but we want to talk about these things in a very real and relatable way. So and personally, I kind of had the idea for this book club because I wanted to force a lot of people whose ideas I admire to read books with me and discuss them with me. So that's what I've been doing. So this is the fourth book that we are reading together. If you missed the first three, we read The Ministry for the Future by Kim Stanley Robinson. And then we read The Valuable Whale by Adrienne Buller, right? That's her name. And then just last fall, we read What If We Get It Right by Ayanna Elizabeth Johnson. So if you want to check out those discussions, feel free to go back and look on our YouTube page, and feel free to check out our webpage for more information about USSEE. So with that, that's enough talk. I would like to turn it over to a discussion. And just as a reminder, we are a diverse society, and we're certainly not all going to agree about things. It's great to have a discussion across disagreements and different points of view. Let's just try to be respectful and keep the conversation about the ideas. If you notice that, maybe you've been talking more, maybe let others jump in. If you haven't been talking and you really want to jump in, encourage you to do so. And I'll try to moderate a little bit, but I'll try to keep a light hand with moderating. So as John said, the book we are reading for today is Jason Hickel's Less is More, and it is about degrowth. And I really wanted to read a book about degrowth because that is the theme for the International Society for Ecological Economics' conference this year. It is a concept that I think has gotten a lot more traction in European circles than American circles, from what I can tell. There are a number of books on it. I picked this one because, and some of the other books were great, but I found this one to be kind of the most accessible and least academic-y, but I encourage you, if you're interested in this topic, to go pick up one of the other great titles out there. So I wanted to throw out at the beginning, for how many of you is a concept of degrowth new? Like you had not heard about it before you read the book? Is there anybody who had not heard about this concept before? Okay, so you're all familiar. All right. Well, I was going to ask if anybody who had not heard about it, like what was their impression being introduced to this concept for the first time. But for those of you who are familiar, I'm curious, how do you find Jason Hickel's take on it compared to, maybe kind of the general conversation about degrowth then? We can start off with that.
Yeah, I'll give you my impression. I have not read any other books about degrowth myself yet. But what struck me about this one is that he is, in the book at least, very patient in sort of taking the reader through a whole bunch of objections that are otherwise, I think, within the degrowth circles already issues we have dealt with. I think, really to get everybody on the same page, because for a lot of people, this subject will be controversial or confusing.
I'll just jump in right there too. I think it's actually been a while since I read the book, unfortunately. But I do think that, like you said at the beginning, Laura, like he really makes this accessible for non-academics and people who haven't heard anything about degrowth before, who maybe aren't aware of some of the downfalls of capitalism or where some of these things have come from and the origins. So I think that that makes it, yeah, accessible for everybody. I think I live and work in Europe, so I'm more in the circles over here, and there are a lot of, yeah, differing opinions and differing definitions of what degrowth even is and what that entails. And I think this is a really good place to start and grounds it in um, maybe more like fact or more history, let's say, instead of these controversies, which I think is really helpful.
I'd like to jump in there as well and say that I I used it as part of a teaching aid for an undergrad course, and there's a lot of students who have heard something about degrowth, are interested in the topic, but don't quite know where to start. They know that there's something broken in the world, but um, they're not sure of how to approach it. And it brings together a lot of the different various concepts. And it's a really nice introductory form to things beyond the degrowth itself, but more to critical thinking. So it's a great book to get the conversation started for anyone who'd like to get a little bit riled up and a little bit more involved.
Something I noticed was that he uses a lot of economic concepts that we learn about in basic economics classes, but then he doesn't actually use the words or definitions to help define it. So it actually makes accessing economic principles really easy for people who are reading this book and they don't even know that they're accessing these principles, which I really appreciated.
Go ahead, Eric. Yeah.
Yeah, I'd say I feel like reading the book, we've been talking about these ideas for a long time now. It seems like as, I'm in the middle, second half of my career. And I remember Laura and I went to graduate school together, and a lot of these same ideas were being tossed around in the late 90s and early 2000s. And, there was a, steady state economy, um, donut economics more recently, and now degrowth. And I think the book does a good job at introducing these concepts to, a new modern audience, current audience. But I still kind of feel like we haven't really made that much progress in, the 25 years since we were in graduate school. And, we're coming up with new terms, and I don't know, it was just kind of disappointing, I think, to
Hmm. Can you say
I don't know.
progress in what way? Like, what would you have wanted to see a bit more progress in, Eric?
Yeah, I mean, I we're getting better, maybe better at communicating some of these ideas, but in terms of like actual practice, like changing how our economy and society functions, like grounding it more in reducing material and energy use, like it's we're getting further away from implementation, especially in the United States.
Yeah, I'd love to hear other thoughts on how the degrowth conversation has progressed over the last few decades. Because as Eric points out, yeah, this is a concept that's been around for a while. Any thoughts on that?
I think the name really throws a lot of people off. For instance, I was part of an email exchange recently and actually talking about UC, and we mentioned this book club, and one of the recipients of the email pretty much skipped over the entire email and just hyper focused on the word degrowth as if the UC had something like that was you know, the premise of our entire society. And it felt, mm, it, it didn't feel good. To be like just put in this box without anyway. But what it did make me realize, and Eric was part of this conversation, we talked more about like, okay, yeah, it kind of sucks to be caught up on semantics, but like people do have a lot of issues with the word degrowth, and maybe it's an American thing because we're so bigger and better and whatever. But yeah, I don't know. I wonder sometimes if, as we keep redefining things, we lose some people, and I, I don't know. I'd like to hear other people's thoughts on the name.
Yeah, Jane, go ahead.
I just wanted to make a quick comment on the name actually. So I was at the ESEE or EC whatever conference in Spain last year as well, and that was the first time that I heard that the name degrowth comes from the French décroissance, I think, which I don't speak French, but which means degrowth. And the reason that they chose the name was because they knew that it was so negative that no one would try to steal it, and they didn't want it to be reappropriated to mean something else or for the meaning to be scrambled, which changed how I view this as well, because I also thought like, okay, it is people hear the word and are already like kind of up in arms. So learning that made me think like, yeah, okay, I understand that, but when we're not communicating it, I don't know what the best way is to reach people. And I think there is this connotation of like degrowth and then like population growth, and people start to like really, you know, but that was a really interesting thing for me to learn where the roots of that came from and why. So yeah, just thought I'd share it.
Yeah, I think that's a really good point because this capitalism is extremely good, as we've seen, at taking anything and selling it back to us. And I think this certainly happened with the whole sustainable development narrative. It had happened with green growth, etc. So that makes a lot of sense what you're saying there. They've picked degrowth because it's in your face. You can't really go around it. It's clear. It's to the point. It tells us exactly what needs to be happening. I personally think it's a great phrase because it's to the point. It's clear.
Yeah, Tom?
Yeah, hi, I'm Tom Olivier. I'm a visitor, and I have to admit, I just saw the club notice recently, so I haven't read the book, but I've been interested in steady state economics and décroissance, so degrowth for a long time. I'm mainly a climate activist now in retirement, but I deal a lot with local politicians, and I just wanted to say that I think one of the problems with one of the reasons we don't make progress in terms of moving people to accept ecological economics in political decisions is that the idea that growth is good and necessary for the well-being of communities is now really deeply entrenched in the minds of all sorts of decision makers, public decision makers, be they administrators or elected officials and so on. I mean, I can't think of a single elected official in this country that I know of that espouses degrowth or steady state economics. And so many, I think, see they're taking on a very high political cost if they start asserting, no, we don't need to grow anymore. And I think there's just this huge cultural momentum, and it's very tough. But I think it's something that we won't win on unless we can make progress against it. My concern is, or my worry is, or the silver lining may be that, with all the environmental crises we're seeing now, people are starting to have to recognize limits to growth. And that people with climate change, people are starting to recognize, the growth of greenhouse gases is really destructive. And we have to start curtailing that. And that may open the door to a more receptive thinking to degrowth and related sort of economic theories.
Yeah, well said. Sarah?
I am pretty fascinated with the tension between some of the most, well, some highly prominent thought leaders within the liberal side of politics in America. Basically, Ezra Klein interviewed Jason Hickel a couple years ago about this book. And Ezra Klein now has his new book called Abundance, which on the face of it seems so much antithesis of degrowth. Abundance is, you just think of like ample things. But if you, I've started reading the book Abundance, and he really does focus on some of the aspects that are actually part of the degrowth movement, with building up the public good, providing, in Kate Raworth's language, a social foundation with healthcare, education, affordable housing. So I think there's this really interesting tension going on in American politics right now. And I also get this sense that for the short term political horizon, it's just impossible to have a degrowth agenda. I think Ezra Klein's ideas about creating more affordable ways of achieving a social foundation is the right way to go. And I've also just been wrestling with these ideas about different time horizons. And the more I read about degrowth and post growth, the more I'm convinced that we have to get there. But I also think we're in this like really difficult political situation right now where I got to say, like, Ezra Klein's argument that if we push too hard on the degrowth agenda right now, it'll just result in more polarization and backlash. Like various, I think AOC a few times had some, I don't actually remember which politician, but if you try to get people to eat less meat right now in America, and if you try to get them to buy smaller cars, that is not going to win over the people who are oscillating back between, you know, Democrat, Republican. So all that is to say, I think we're in a really interesting situation right now, and I hope that this idea of degrowth and post growth can gain wider understanding of what it is and what it isn't. And we'll see what happens in the next few years politically here in America.
Interesting. Yeah, Sergio, go ahead. You want to respond to that?
Hello, I'm also a visitor. Actually, I'm from Costa Rica, and I've been part of the Mesoamerican Society for Ecological Economics, and hopefully I'll get to see some of you in Oslo this year. I haven't read this book particular. I saw the call as well. I read the book Degrowth by Giorgio Callis, and related to the comment that Sarah just did, I think it's quite interesting where it should be something like degrowth for the few rich, right? For the super rich, for growth for the humanity. It's because actually that's what we can get. We can get growth in housing, affordable housing, and energy, and so on, for the majority of the world, where the very few rich, those are the ones who need that degrowth. I think Giorgio Callis makes this very compelling when he mentions about how it is about that reinvestment, like all those, after all the production takes place and you have all these profits, how do you reinvest that into all these social needs? And so, definitely the name has something that is not appealing to many. But again, and that's why this book is not about the growth, right? It's the name of the book is less, is more, at the end it's also telling people, okay, it's about more. But I think at the end it's about more, we can get more as a whole.
Yeah, I think this is an interesting conversation. So, yeah, Sarah, I don't disagree with you, but I want to go to, so some of the, so he actually proposes some specific solutions that, and he invites the reader to say, these are just some of my ideas, add your own. Like, how would we get to a post-growth, post-capitalist society? And I feel like some of those solutions, they're probably along a continuum of social acceptance, right? So what do you all think? Are there some that maybe we, would be something you could push right now, even maybe not using the word degrowth, that are a little bit of an easier sell, and then moving towards things that are a bit more challenging? I'm thinking of specifically the things in chapter 5, the pathways to a post-capitalist world. So what do you all think about those? Are there some things that you think could be sold to even the American public at this point? Especially now that people are, it seems like, kind of pissed off about inequality and lack of ability to kind of make a decent living in the US. And yeah.
Yeah, I think there's a lot of sensible proposals in that section. I mean, I can see things like the right to repair that he mentions, ending planned obsolescence. These are things that piss people off tremendously. I think similarly, investment in public transportation seems to be quite popular, especially in the United States, where car dependence is immense. So yeah, I think that just trying to have a quick look what else he threw out in that chapter. But yeah, I think there's a lot of sensible proposals that it shouldn't be too hard of a sell, because you're basically talking about how can we be more socialist in a way, and have more social policies that help everyone.
Yeah, Eric, I'm going to get 2 minutes, but it reminds me a little bit of like the Affordable Care Act, right? The Affordable Care Act is a phenomenally popular piece of legislation in the US when it was proposed, and it remains so. But when people called it Obamacare, and it's, then people didn't like it. But when they listed the actual things in the bill, everyone was like, yeah, I'm for that. Yeah, I support that, right? So maybe it's a case of, rather than coming out and saying, let's do degrowth, which people are going to go, say, hey, wouldn't you like it if your things didn't break after a year? Wouldn't you like it if there were more affordable public transportation? People are like, yeah, I'm down with that, right? And you kind of, you sell the components of it. Eric, go ahead.
Yeah, Leon mentioned the right to repair. Just, I think it was yesterday, I saw something about the Google Nest thermostats. An earlier version that was popular in Europe is not going to be supported anymore. So the author of the article was talking about this whole Internet of Things, that this was going to be the revolution, right? All of our stuff is going to be connected, and then it's going to be smart, and we'll get all these efficiencies, but all those things have to be maintained. And what happens when a private company says, no, we're not going to support that product anymore? And then we've got really sophisticated electronics, not just like a knife that breaks after a year of use. Like you've got, a Nest, or, somebody mentioned like a heart pump was at one point a company went bankrupt or something. And so, that product wasn't supported, and people need that for their life. So I think having like open source software that can be, people can maintain these things into the future. That could go a long way, perhaps. I don't know. I think it just struck me that the obsolescence piece might get a lot worse with these connected devices, and as everything gets hooked up to the internet.
Yeah.
So I haven't figured out where to put where I can get my hands up thing icon. So my apologies. And I don't think I have it in my version. So I probably have to upgrade soon. But you raise a very interesting point. But again, like in the same vein that capitalism comes in and takes over any kind of action, a lot of these like legislation that gets passed for right to repair, like in Massachusetts, there was one for automotive parts, and it was supposed to get rolled out to a whole bunch of other states, and it was going to be grandfathered in and everything. There is pushback because, again, the political system is controlled by corporations and not, people. So a lot of these things that would in reality be are proposed with removing the planned obsolescence, the right to repair, more public things, are constantly being attacked but the solutions do exist out there. And I'm going to throw in this book that I'm reading is because part of what we do is I think the book proposes a great theoretical start, but it needs to be followed by action. And this book that I'm part of the Wellbeing Economy Network, Beautiful Solutions. So this is part of like what happens in action and how you can take the theory and apply it. And there are tons of examples of this happening all over the place, except they don't get the recognition and visibility for what they do. There was an amazing uh, kind of cooperative happening in Paris, and it's documented in a research case of what did it contribute if you look at the return on investment from that reuse, repurpose. It was essentially a degrowth hub, and it was just phenomenal of what it did in community engagement and enrichment. But because it didn't produce private wealth, it was dismantled the first chance they got. And that's the problem. It's always about private wealth.
Yeah, Leon.
Yeah, that's a fantastic point, and one I thought I okay on. Possibly the conversation we really should be having about this book. I think we're all on board pretty much with the central message it's trying to sell us. And the thing I flagged up, one of the concerns I had with the book was really like, how? How are we actually going to implement any of this or all of this, given that basically the people who are the wealthy can exert undue influence in politics and are extremely hostile to most of his ideas. So how in such a political system do we actually get this done when the system is so actively rigged against us? And I'm concerned, and I mean, because basically in the book he says, I'm not a political strategist. And then he offers some observations. You think, well, at least we don't have to go to a totalitarian system. But he doesn't really have an answer other than saying, well, this will have to be a collective endeavor, a collective project. And sort of given the history he has in the first chapter, where he talks about violent resistance that was required to overthrow feudalism, part of me is frankly concerned that this may very well involve violence and people willing to put their lives and their bodies on the line to really fight for the things that they want. As we've already seen, for example, you had these protests against the oil pipeline, was in Alaska, I believe, where people really bodily got involved and were dragged off of these protests. And we see it here in the UK where I live, where climate protest movements are being harshly criminalized, and Just Stop Oil protesters have been jailed for years, and in some cases not even for protesting, but for planning a protest. So this is the climate we are moving towards. There is this authoritarian sweep moving in that is very harshly cracking down on any kind of resistance. So how in such a climate do we move towards degrowth? And I don't think he has a clear answer to this in the book, at least. But of course, the book is 5 years old. So I don't know what your thoughts are in general about that aspect of how will we achieve this?
Allison?
I mean, my immediate thought is education. Like, we solve this. We keep saying, let me back up. The problem that I see with a lot of these movements is that we're expecting the work to be done for us instead of recognizing that we have to do it for ourselves. And so what that means is it has to be a collective thing. And so while he does, he's like, this needs to be done together collectively. But that means like having really uncomfortable conversations with our neighbors. That means doing really uncomfortable things ourselves, in order to start creating this reality that we actually do believe in and that we see as like the foundational beginnings of a new future. Right. And so, I mean, I think something that he talks about in the first part of the book is how researchers did a bunch of studies, and they looked at what are the things that have led to an increase of lifespan. And one researcher was like, oh, GDP or higher income. But it actually turns out it was sanitation. Right. And so if we look at that like really simple concept of sanitation and making sure that people have an easy access to clean drinking water and a place to use the bathroom, that is so simple, but it's not sexy. It's not fun to talk about. It requires public infrastructure, and especially in America, we don't want to give up our private lands for public infrastructure, right? I mean, even in America, he says, actually, I don't know if it was this book or another book that I'm reading. This one's really great, The Big Necessity by Rose George. She's amazing. But 1.7 million people in the United States don't have access to sanitation, right? I mean, look at Flint, Michigan. So many places. Anyway, my point in saying all this is that I think that it's actually going to be it could be a lot easier, but we're making it so much more difficult, especially going back to, I forget who was commenting about, or I think it was Tom commenting about politicians. And politicians would never get on board with this because it would be the death of their career. Like any politician that is like, we're going to do degrowth concepts, even without using the word degrowth, they're never going to get elected again. Right. And so here we are, we're up against, again, private and public interests in direct contrast with each other. So I don't know. I guess to round that all up with like coming back to education and just getting people thinking about these things, reading books like this, recognizing like, oh, economics, oh, ecology. How can we learn more about these little things and then make you know, little steps towards progress.
Yeah, great points. Jane.
Yeah, thanks. I think that's a really good point. And I think that you made a really good point when you said that work needs to be done collectively, but more than that, we have to do things that we're uncomfortable with. And I think that we've become extremely comfortable in, like, especially in the United States and in politics, and we see that right now when we see people not being willing. I mean, I don't know what circles you're in. I'm originally from Alabama. My family is very Alabama. So that's the only way that I can say it is that, things that seem very obvious and very clear to me, and the way that we need to be engaging in, or the way that we should be engaging with our own politics that affect us in a daily way, we're not engaging with them because it is uncomfortable and because it is a task for people to educate themselves, to find education, or to even for people to have access to that education. I think, Leon, you also make a good point about like how, but I do think that the main thing has to be rooted in people. And whether that's talking about degrowth or anti-fascism or whatever it is that we're talking about, I think that we are going to have to, as a people, figure out how to stop letting politicians divide us, because that is where they get power, and that's part of the strategy. And it's not really about what's good for the people, or what, I mean, I know that we know all of these things, right? But I do think it is a very hard question to answer. How do we move from that to this? And the only thing that I keep coming back to is that we have to invest in people. And that means that each one of us has to invest in uncomfortable conversations with people around us, with uncomfortable conversations with colleagues, with uncomfortable conversations with family, with politicians, and whatever it is. And that is hard. And because we have been trained and become used to having things done for us and having someone make a decision for us. I mean, that's why we choose to have, one central leader or something, because we just want it done, right? It's a hard hurdle to overcome, and I don't know how we communicate that, right? I don't know what the right way is. Is that something for science communications? Is that something for another narrative somewhere else? I don't know where the right place to start is, but I guess I just feel like in my heart of hearts, right, that if we're not starting on this level of people where the whole thing is about well-being and the whole thing is about each other, then we're missing the point from the get-go. And yeah.
Yeah, interesting, Jane. Tom, go ahead. You are next.
Thank you. Yeah, I was going to say, I think it's really necessary to actively try to move the ideas from degrowth and so on into a political sphere. In other words, you have to have political activists who understand the principles of this sort of alternative economics and in different ways try to bring it into the political processes. And I would say from experience at a local level, you often can, there are plenty of opportunities to go speak to your elected officials, ideally in numbers, and if nothing else, strike fear in them a bit. I mean, that's one of the big forces of politics. If you do all these things to promote growth, economic growth, which actually often is extremely expensive if it triggers people coming in to fill newly created jobs. The school costs are enormous, and local governments can actually lose money on lots of economic development projects that are pushed by people. Understand, the more academic ideas you think are needed, and learn to meet with and educate and build trust with your elected officials. And I think the other important thing is to have good proposals that are alternatives with arguments that are relevant in a political sphere, i.e., if you do this growth, it's going to cost you more money to build schools and you're going to raise taxes and people won't like that. That all said, to come back to Allison's comment, on several occasions, I've had elected officials talking to me in private say, well, Tom, I actually agree with practically everything you want us to do, but if I say it, I'll never get elected again. So it's just this tough fight, and you have to engage a lot of people with the good ideas into the political sort of combat arena. Thanks.
Yeah, so I like this kind of both and, conversation about like there has to be grassroots support through individual conversations for the political movement, but then moving it into the political sphere also. That's interesting. Leon, go ahead.
Yeah, thanks. You make some really good points there, Tom. Because when people were saying, "Oh, yeah, it's about education," I think my one response to that would immediately be, "This sounds very familiar from the playbook of climate change." And it makes it a little bit about, "Oh, we're making this all about individual responsibility," rather than saying this is a systemic issue that needs systemic solutions. Because a lot of people are already on board with these ideas and want the things that the degrowth movement stands for. It's just that I think, as you say, Tom, when you even politicians, I've heard this from other people as well, that politicians in private will admit, like, yeah, I agree that this should happen, but I can't voice this because it'll be the end of my political career. And that's a really tough one. What do you do with a political system that is so broken? And I guess it is about. I don't know, this sounds incredibly cliche to say, oh, we have to show up and show what we want, and then our politicians will listen. But do they? I don't know. The track record so far isn't great.
Yeah, I think we can agree on that. Track record so far is not great. John, what do you think?
So, having been an elected official and being responsible for a nearly $100 million budget, I will say you got to look at these things on two hands. On a macro level, national level, some of these things are much more easier to do than on a local level. There are things you can do on a local level, and we put some of those in place when I was when I was elected. But especially on the local level, you have real issues with budgets. For example, where I am now, I'm knee deep in actually neck deep in it. It's basically $1 million increase every year just from benefits. That's not sustainable for anybody to pay for. So how do you figure out ways to try to save money, or you're not going to save $1 million a year, period. And so there's things you can do to make, invest in parks, make things better. But at the end of the day, people want their salaries, which I think we all agree to, having a good salary that people can do things with, having the benefits that they have. But how do you overcome that? I don't think it's that people, at least elected officials on a local level, they don't care or don't want to listen to it. It's real tangible issues regarding money of how do you pay for this in order to overcome these issues. And that's where you really have a push and pull of trying to accomplish these things in a sustainable way, and still have a budget that's under control. And oftentimes budgets, at least I'll say in the Northeast, the Northeast budgets are not in good shape. So.
Yeah, and unlike the federal government, at the local level, you have to balance the budget, right? So you can't necessarily, well, you can take out bonds, I believe, but yeah, you can't go into debt in the same way, right? So
you can only go so far, and then you hit your bond limit, and you basically go bankrupt.
Yeah. Leon, did you want to respond to that?
I think this nicely ties in with what is basically the second leg of Hickel's argument, because we've talked a little bit about the reduction in material and energy throughput. And he says the only way we can achieve this is if we do something about economic inequality. And you ask quite rightly, John, budgets are a problem. Where should the money come from? This is where he comes up with, I think, the other very unpopular proposals, which we can basically simply summarize as tax the rich, and take a lot of that wealth and income that is sloshing around the economic system and redistribute it. That's where the money should be coming from, because absolutely no, you can't keep squeezing systems that are already under pressure to get your 100 million a year to deal with rising costs of things. That money should come from somewhere else, and that will require governments to do things that, again, are very unpopular with those who have the influence on that very same political system. But I think there too, there is a very broad base of support amongst, well, the proverbial 99%. I think a lot of people are quite willing to stand up for that, to protest for this. Whether that will achieve anything, that remains to be seen. But I think that's where there is the lever that we can all push.
But local levels are much different than national levels of government in the sense of being able to do some of those things. I don't necessarily disagree with that aspect, but on a local level, there's only so many tools that you have at your disposal because you're the lowest form. And then the other levels have priority. That's just the way we have our system. So it does limit what you can do.
Yeah, I want to invite anybody who hasn't had the chance to speak yet, who has an observation about the book, or yeah, Ivan, are you raising your hand, or are you're waving? Ivan, can you unmute? And anybody else, feel free to raise your hand with the picture. Yeah, go ahead.
Yeah, so you can hear me now. Yeah, right?
Yes.
Can you hear me? Yes.
We can.
I'm Ivan Kanchev. I'm PhD in Sustainable Development. And I would like to offer my opinion on Hickel's 3-page verb about new money for new economies on page 238. And the previous speaker can read something about it. I understand the constraints of local budgets. In that respect, my advice would be the case of Ithaca. Why not try complementary currencies in terms of degrowth? Hickel also agrees upon that concept of complementary currency, where the municipality or the town or whatever can issue its own complementary currency and balance the budget. But on the other hand, it strikes me extraordinary that the US, I mean, the US audience has money issues in their budget when they have the exorbitant privilege. They have the right to print out all the money they need to balance their budget, to fund trillions of dollars. And the rest of us, I mean, I'm from Europe, we have to make things in order to sell you. I mean, in the US, and Hickel also writes about this. The US, the cost to print $100 bill costs nothing, maybe a couple of cents, and those are printed as well, minted as well. But in the rest of the world, where we do not have the exorbitant privilege, we have to work for every cent and pay the interest on top of it, mainly to US banks. So Hickel analyzed this issue, but only in 2.5 pages. It's really insignificant. My dissertation was based on the monetary issues, the monetary problem. And if we do not solve the money problem, the monetary system, we cannot have any degrowth. It's not about only education, policy, democracy. If we don't solve the money issue, the monetary system, we cannot have degrowth or sustainable development with the petrodollar monetary system. That's the key issue that Hickel just touches about, but as I said, only 2.5 pages. Thank you.
Yeah, thanks for that important point. Yeah, for sure. And just to tie together what I think you were saying with what John was saying, so the federal government certainly can print money, local governments can't, right? So that's an interesting concept of like the local, the Ithaca dollars that they use in their economy, and what would it look like to generate your own currency. Okay, so I want to again invite anybody who, thanks Eric for putting that article there. Anybody who also would like the chance to say something that hasn't been able to speak yet, even ask a question. Don't feel shy. Question, observation, please feel free. Yeah, Dick, go ahead.
Okay, thank you. This has been a pleasure listening to everyone. We're going to degrow. The question is whether we're going to degrow by disaster and then some sort of recovery, or whether we're going to have a smaller disaster and a planned recovery, and the planned recovery has planned degrowth so that the poorer economies, poorer countries are able to survive. And I guess I'm a little more pessimistic than everybody about the idea that we can somehow get the existing system to accommodate new ideas and move along, and that the powerful will wield their power. I've only been watching this for 60 years, but it doesn't look like that's in the cards. And so, I'm embarrassed to say that I'm in the camp that we're going to have a significant disaster, and what we can do now is try to provide advice, provide as much information for those who are still around so that they have information to regrow or to recoup and recover a new system. So I'm in a slightly more disastrous point of view. Thank you.
I hear you. Yeah, it's certainly a plausible pathway. I'd like to say too that I'm currently living in the global south, so I'm living in Nigeria this year. And you could say that in a sense, that catastrophe is here for people in poor parts of the world. So one of the things that has struck me living here is how many people die all the time. Women die in childbirth, at rates that far exceed even the poorest areas of the US. People die when they're burned to death in automobile accidents because of unsafe roads and unsafe trucks that are not regulated, not inspected, et cetera. So, I am realizing how much, I mean, we need more social infrastructure in wealthy countries, but it's very clear to me how much of our social infrastructure we take for granted living in a place like the United States or even in Europe. It saves people's lives. And, one of the things that Jason Hickel says that I appreciate is, degrowth does not mean degrowth everywhere. There are some parts of the world where there needs to be growth and a transfer of wealth to social infrastructure, and particularly places like the global south. And so that's something that I think is interesting to think about how that could happen. Certainly, right now we're seeing a retrenchment of that with slashing of bilateral aid, but yeah. All right. Any other? Oh my gosh, this time flew by. I can't believe it's almost top of the hour already. And again, I welcome y'all to stay on and chat if you'd like. I'm going to go have dinner with my kids at the top of the hour. But anyone else would like to offer us an observation or question about the book if you haven't had the chance to yet? Some final thoughts. Yeah, Peter.
Hi, everybody. I've really enjoyed this very fruitful discussion of a book that I unfortunately did not read, but I have obviously been exposed to many of these debates around degrowth, and particularly from where I work in Brazil. It's been very difficult, even for the ecological economics community, to really come to grips with what needs to be done as far as action. The action, I mean, we have a situation in which we have a fairly socialist, worker-oriented regime that nevertheless only sees the possibility for stimulating a redistributive economy based on a drill baby drill mentality, which is completely disappointing for all of us to see that the only alternative that is seen for generating resources that could be redistributed is to drill at the mouth of the Amazon. That's a very kind of down thing to say at the end here, but I agree completely with you, Laura, on the need for, particularly in areas where economies are still made up of very impoverished people, where there really is need for continuing, whether it's growth, if it's material growth, whether it's growth necessarily in consumerism, or having more goods that are going to be obsolete very soon, and that would be a direction to avoid, I would think. So I think that there may be ways to try to work around that, but I can't imagine the people in Northeast Brazil or in the Nigeria being happy with not being able to have more of something that they really require in order to survive. So I'm with you on that. Thank you.
Yeah, thank you for that comment. Anyone else? Well, so let me ask, so Jason Hickel invites us to come up with other pathways and solutions. He names a few in the book. So even you mentioned, monetary policy, getting away from the petrodollar has to be part of this. Any other your favorite solution for moving in a degrowth direction that maybe Jason Hickel didn't mention or hasn't been mentioned yet. Yeah, Evan, go ahead. Yeah.
Yeah, actually, I'm kind of critical on Jason Hickel, especially in his latest book. But in terms of this book, I mean, it's 2020. Jason Hickel does not appreciate the severity of the climate crisis. I advise everybody to visit the Arctic News blog. That's a blog by 20 odd scientists in different spheres of science, from climate science to political science, in my case. The climate crisis is existential. It's not linear, it's abrupt, and will unravel in the coming decade. Jason Hickel correctly criticizes BECCS. Back in the days, BECCS, bioenergy with carbon capture and storage, was the general idea. These days, what is DACS, direct air carbon capture and storage, and the most recent are these positive tipping points. They're illusionary tipping points that exist to amuse politicians or to convey that climate change is not that serious. But the degrowth will happen, as the previous speaker said. Degrowth will happen, whether you like it or not, and it's currently happening. But it's not a planned degrowth, as Jason Hickel advised us all to do. It will be called a recession, and it has started in this year, in 2025, and will progress in the following years. That's unavoidable. You can see how in your 401ks as the stock market collapses and so on. But degrowth, I also have to point one other very important thing. The article by Hansen. He also wants or criticizes degrowth because degrowth will eliminate the protective blanket what we have from our pollution, that will reduce the solar albedo, and that will increase global warming to a very rapid scale. That's why degrowth has to be is the only solution, but it has to be done with a planned way. And one comprehensive plan that me and other colleagues are working on can be seen on the climate plan on the Arctic News blog. It's radical, maybe it's a little inhumane, but it's necessary. The time has come and passed for sustainable development for all. The crucial problem is survival of mankind as a species. So have to think about that. It's not it's not a simple issue to be tackled. Thank you.
Okay, the climate crisis, certainly. Tom, I'm going to give you the last word here.
Well, just quickly to second Ivan, back in 2018, the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change published this 1.5 degree report, which was extremely scary, saying that we have to change our ways in so many ways if we're going to have good futures. And they based their recommendations on computer modelings, and the scenarios that were the most successful as far as containing climate change were called the green and sustainable, I think, and key ingredients in that were reducing the global human population over time and the size of the global economy. But the one nice thing within it was that the average GDP per person actually increased. So it was a win-win situation, but it involved giving up current or changing from current circumstances, both in economic and population growth.
Yep. And the other good news I will say is that one of the best ways people have found to naturally reduce population growth is to empower, educate, and give healthcare to women, which is something hopefully we all can get behind. And that is slowing population growth. Great. Thank you guys. This was a wonderful conversation. I really appreciate hearing all your perspectives. I think we all have different degrees of how optimistic or pessimistic we're feeling, but I think we all agree this is a very complex challenge. So I just want to encourage all of you to continue to grapple with these ideas, continue to communicate them. And it was wonderful to have you all on the call today. And stay tuned for the next book club, which will probably be in the fall. If you have suggestions for what book we should read, send them my way. I'm always open to hearing from you. So thank you and have a wonderful rest of your day.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Bye.
Thanks, everybody.
Bye-bye.
Thank you.